When Catherine walked into Windsor that morning, she had no idea she'd leave questioning everything, even her own silence. But what she saw that day would ignite a confrontation the monarchy couldn't contain. The day had begun like so many others on the royal calendar, meticulously scheduled and outwardly perfect. A spring luncheon had been arranged in honor of one of Camilla's newest charitable patronages, bringing together several generations of the royal family under one roof. Bright flowers adorned the entrance hall, footmen bustling about with trays of tea and delicate pastries, and the gentle murmur of polite conversation weaving through the corridors. Catherine arrived with William and their 3 children, dressed immaculately, and wearing the practiced smile of a woman who knew how to endure these gatherings with quiet grace. But as she stepped into the grand hall, something inside her stirred. Her eyes instinctively found Charlotte among the younger royals. Ordinarily, her daughter would have been chatting animatedly with cousins, giggling at some private joke, or sitting proudly among the children with the quiet confidence that Catherine so admired. But today Charlotte seemed different. She was withdrawn, perched on the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze lowered as though she were trying to disappear into the tapestry behind her. Catherine's smile faltered for just a second, though no one else seemed to notice. It wasn't the first time Catherine had felt that subtle undercurrent of tension when Camilla was present. There had been remarks in the past of small, biting words masked as advice or harmless banter, but Catherine had always let them pass for the sake of peace. After all, royal life demanded a certain tolerance for unpleasantness, and she had learned long ago how to swallow her discomfort and smile through it. But this felt different. The staff moved briskly through the hall, arranging flowers, refilling cups, and ensuring everyone's needs were met, but Catherine's attention was no longer on them. Her focus was solely on her daughter, who kept darting quick, nervous glances in Camilla's direction, before lowering her eyes again. It was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but not Catherine. She watched as Charlotte stood up briefly to speak to one of her cousins, and caught Camilla observing her with a thin-lipped smile, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Catherine felt her chest tighten. Over the years, she had perfected the art of remaining calm, even when she felt anything but. Yet now, something more primal was stirring, something maternal, protective, and unwilling to look the other way. Her instincts sharpened, honed by years of quietly navigating palace politics while shielding her children from the worst of it. Whatever was happening between Camilla and Charlotte, Catherine knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She resolved in that moment to find out exactly what was unsettling her daughter, no matter the cost. But nothing could have prepared Catherine for the moment she saw with her own eyes, the moment that broke her composure. It was just a quiet hallway, empty except for 2 figures, but what Catherine overheard there would change her forever. Excusing herself from the small circle of senior aides and family friends gathered in the drawing room, Catherine claimed she needed a moment to check on the children. Her exit was calm, deliberate, and unnoticed by anyone too absorbed in polite conversation to sense the storm brewing just beneath her composed surface. But each step she took away from that room carried a weight heavier than the crown itself. Something about Charlotte's silence earlier, the downcast eyes, and those nervous glances toward Camilla gnawed at her. She couldn't sit and smile through another minute without knowing the truth. The hallway was cool and eerily quiet, lined with closed doors that muffled the faint sounds of laughter and clinking china from beyond. As she approached the children's side salon, Catherine caught a faint voice, sharp, clipped, and unmistakably familiar, cutting through the stillness. It was Camilla's. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat, and instinctively leaned closer to the slightly ajar door. The next words sent a chill down her spine. "You really ought to learn your place," Camilla said, her tone low but edged with disdain. "You're not here to show off. You're here to be seen and not heard. Do you understand?" Charlotte's reply was barely audible, a fragile whisper that made Catherine's stomach twist. "But I was only trying to help," the little girl said meekly, her voice quivering under the weight of words too cruel for a child to bear. At that moment, Catherine froze. Her mind replayed every look, every comment she'd dismissed before, as nothing more than awkward attempts at humor. But now she saw it clearly. This wasn't a single misstep. This was a pattern. A calculated erosion of her daughter's spirit, carried out under the guise of discipline and hierarchy. Weeks, maybe even months of quiet jabs and humiliations that she had been too careful, too trusting to see before. She pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself, Every muscle in her body coiled tight with fury she dared not yet unleash. She knew this wasn't the place, and not the time, to confront it. Not yet. The monarchy had its rules, and Catherine knew how to play the game, but she also knew when to strike. With a final breath, she withdrew silently from the door, forcing her expression back into its royal mask of composure. But inside, her resolve hardened like stone. No more ignoring, no more tolerating, no more silence. And as Catherine straightened her spine and returned to the room, she knew this battle had only just begun. The royal dining room sparkled with civility, but Catherine's eyes were fixed on the predator in their midst. The table was set perfectly, every cup and plate aligned as though measured by the inch, and the gentle hum of laughter and polite chatter floated through the air. To any outsider, it was the very picture of harmony, a royal family basking in its own tradition and grace. But beneath the surface, Catherine felt the strain in every breath, every smile forced just a little too wide, every glance at Charlotte that carried an unspoken warning. She sat in her place, her posture impeccable, but inside her composure was fraying, thread by thread. Charlotte sat beside her, quiet and trying to be invisible. But when the tray of scones came around, she reached timidly for a second one. It was an innocent gesture, the kind no one would ordinarily notice, except for the sharp voice that cut through the room like a blade. "We don't want to appear greedy, do we?" Camilla's words, draped in a thin veil of humor, landed like a stone in the pit of Catherine's stomach. Charlotte froze, her small hand hovering over the plate before she slowly withdrew it and rested it in her lap. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in a bright blush of humiliation as she ducked her head. Catherine's knuckles tightened around her own teacup so fiercely she could feel the porcelain strain. She had seen enough to know this was no harmless joke. William, seated just a few chairs away, continued chatting with Charles, oblivious to the undercurrent of venom running through the table. He spoke of tours and schedules, his voice light, his attention firmly elsewhere. Catherine wanted to scream at him to look, to see what was happening under his nose, but she bit her tongue. There would be time for that later. Her eyes never left Camilla now, tracking every movement, every calculated remark, disguised as etiquette. She saw it for what it truly was, a pattern. Camilla's remarks were always public, yet subtle enough that anyone who wasn't watching closely would assume she meant no harm. A slight smile here, a quiet barb there. It was designed to wound without ever leaving evidence. A cruelty that hid in plain sight. In that moment, Catherine's resolve hardened into something unshakable. She would no longer simply watch, as her daughter was diminished, piece by piece, under the guise of propriety. But she would not rush. She would not allow her fury to trip her into a mistake. No, she would confront this directly, but on her terms, at her time, and in a way no one could ignore or dismiss. But that time would come sooner than she expected, and it would arrive in a storm of words no one could unhear. One quiet evening at Highgrove, Catherine's patience finally snapped, and nothing would ever be the same again. The invitation had arrived as a gesture of reconciliation. Charles, sensing the tension that had begun to poison family gatherings, requested an intimate dinner at Highgrove, just the immediate family, to smooth over what he called recent misunderstandings. Catherine agreed, though not out of hope for peace. She saw it instead as an opportunity, a chance to face what she had been steeling herself for ever since Windsor. This time, she didn't leave Charlotte behind. If anything, she insisted her daughter come, determined to watch over her every moment, to ensure no more harm was done in the shadows. The atmosphere that evening was deceptively warm, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and history. But beneath it all, Catherine could feel the same familiar chill, the one that had been growing ever since she'd caught Camilla in that corridor, speaking to Charlotte like she was something to be silenced rather than cherished. Camilla greeted them with a thin, performative smile, her gaze flitting quickly past Charlotte without acknowledgement, as though the girl didn't exist. Charlotte, ever polite, curtsied lightly and said, "Good evening, Granny." But Camilla, without missing a beat, delivered her retort sharp enough to draw blood, yet soft enough to seem harmless to anyone not paying attention. "Are you sure you're not too tired to be here?" she quipped, her lips curled in that insufferable half-smile. Catherine's heart slammed against her ribs, the words hung in the air, cruel and deliberate, and she caught the way Charlotte's little shoulders stiffened at the remark. But this time, Catherine didn't simply swallow her fury and smile through it. Her eyes narrowed as she turned toward her daughter. "Why don't you go upstairs with Anna, sweetheart?" she said evenly, her voice steady yet loaded. Charlotte looked uncertain, but Catherine gave her the slightest nod of reassurance. Without another word, the child left the room, her footsteps quiet but heavy with confusion. And then, the silence Catherine had been waiting for finally descended. She straightened to her full height, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. But there was nothing calm about what followed. "You will not speak to my daughter that way again," she said, each word cutting through the room like a blade. Her tone was calm but absolute, leaving no room for doubt or debate. Camilla blinked, caught off guard by the icy conviction in Catherine's voice, and for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time ever, she seemed to falter. But even as the room fell silent, and Camilla bristled, Catherine knew this wasn't just about words, it was about drawing a line no one could cross. That night, a hushed confession from Charlotte revealed just how deep Camilla's cuts had gone, and Catherine's resolve hardened like steel. Back at Adelaide Cottage, the grandeur of Highgrove already felt a lifetime away, but the weight of the evening clung to Catherine's shoulders as she led Charlotte upstairs. The girl was quiet, obediently climbing into bed, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her nightdress as though afraid of what silence might bring. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on her daughter's downcast face, knowing the truth was there, if only she could coax it out. Gently, she reached for Charlotte's hand. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice steady but low. "You can tell me what's wrong. You don't have to pretend tonight." Charlotte hesitated. For a moment, Catherine thought she might simply shake her head, but then the words came out, hesitant and heavy. "Granny Camilla," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She doesn't like me. She says I talk too much, that I take up space, that I should just sit and be quiet." Her lips trembled as she added, "She makes me feel like I'm a problem." Catherine froze at the quiet devastation behind those words. Her throat tightened as she pulled Charlotte close, wrapping her arms around her daughter with a fierce tenderness she could no longer contain. "You are not a problem," she said firmly, her voice shaking now with restrained fury. "You are everything that is good and kind and bright, and you have done nothing wrong. Do you understand me? Nothing." Before Charlotte could answer, the door creaked softly, and William stepped in, his expression already serious. He had sensed it too, even if he hadn't fully grasped its depth. Catherine didn't look at him right away. Instead, she kept her eyes on Charlotte, her voice dropping to a quiet but determined tone, as she began to recount everything she had heard, and seen every slight, every cutting remark, every glance meant to shrink their daughter's spirit. William listened without interruption, but the set of his jaw grew tighter with each detail. When Catherine finished, he stepped forward and placed a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "We won't let this continue," he said, his tone measured but brimming with resolve. "You don't have to see her again if you don't want to. Not for now." Catherine nodded, grateful for his support, but knowing this was only the beginning. Together, they agreed Charlotte would not attend any event hosted by Camilla for the time being. There would be no more quiet suffering, not on their watch. But news travels quickly in royal circles, and what Catherine didn't know was that Camilla had her own plans for their next encounter. At Balmoral, under Scotland's grey skies, the simmering feud between two future queens finally boiled over in full view of the royal household. The annual summer retreat to Balmoral had always been presented as a sanctuary, a time for the family to retreat from public glare and find solace in tradition. Yet beneath the tranquil facade, the tension Catherine carried from Windsor and Highgrove shadowed her every step. The family gathered as expected, polite greetings, faint smiles, the usual rhythms of royal ritual. But for Catherine, every glance at Camilla felt like a battle unspoken. She kept Charlotte close, her hand often resting protectively on her daughter's back, unwilling to leave her alone even for a moment. For several days, Catherine managed to maintain this vigilant guard. Walks through the fields, quiet breakfasts in the morning room, even reading by the fire, she was always within earshot. And for a time, Camilla seemed to understand, refraining from the sort of comments that had brought Catherine to the edge before. But the peace was brittle, and everyone in the household could feel it, like a storm waiting to break. One afternoon, as William accompanied Charles on a fishing excursion, and Catherine sat speaking with Lady Sarah about upcoming engagements, a household aide approached her discreetly. "Your Highness," they murmured, "a call for you from London. It sounds urgent." For the briefest second, she hesitated, her gaze flicking instinctively toward the garden where Charlotte played. But she allowed herself to be led away, trusting that her daughter was in safe hands. That trust shattered the moment she returned. As she passed the sunroom on her way back, the faint sound of Camilla's voice cut through the air, sharp and dripping with condescension. "Your mummy talks too much," she heard, the words slow and deliberate. "Just like you." Something inside Catherine snapped. The fury she had swallowed for weeks, the restraint she had worn like armor, fell away all at once. Without hesitation, she pushed open the door, her voice calm but laced with steel. "That's enough." The words hung in the air like thunder. The room froze. Camilla looked up, startled to find Catherine standing there, her expression unflinching, her presence commanding the silence. Staff members who had been lingering nearby stood rooted to the spot, eyes darting between the two women as though afraid to breathe. Catherine stepped fully into the room, her voice quiet yet impossible to ignore. "You will not speak to my daughter that way. Not now. Not ever." The weight of her words left no doubt, no room for rebuttal. For the first time, Catherine made it clear that the line had been crossed, and she would not let it happen again. But what came next would shake even the unflappable king, and echo through palace corridors for weeks to come. When King Charles tried to mediate, he discovered just how far Catherine was willing to go, and it left him speechless. The confrontation in the sunroom had sent ripples through Balmoral, and by evening, whispers had already reached Charles. He summoned Catherine quietly, requesting a private word in his study, hoping to diffuse what he clearly believed to be a minor misunderstanding, before it exploded into something irreparable. Catherine entered the room with her head high, her expression calm but unyielding. Charles motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. His opening words were careful, almost rehearsed, as he asked her to let it go, for the sake of appearances, for the sake of the family's image. He reminded her of the press, of the public scrutiny, of the weight of tradition and protocol that rested on all their shoulders. But Catherine didn't flinch. Her answer came swiftly, cold but controlled. "No title, no duty, no photograph in the world comes before my daughter's dignity," she said, her voice even yet edged with steel. Charles blinked, clearly taken aback by her resolve. He leaned forward, warning her softly that her defiance, though perhaps justified in her mind, carried the risk of deep and lasting fallout, not just for herself, but for William, for the children, for the fragile unity of the monarchy itself. For a moment, Catherine let the silence stretch between them, the air charged with a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words. Then she looked him squarely in the eye and answered in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "Then let the fallout come," she said, "because I will not allow silence to protect cruelty. Not in this family, and not toward my child." At that precise moment, the door opened and William stepped inside, having heard enough of the conversation to understand its gravity. Without hesitation, he positioned himself beside his wife, his presence silent but unmistakably supportive. Charles glanced between them, his heir and his heir's wife, united in a way that even he could not fracture, and something shifted in his demeanor. For all his authority, Charles recognized that this battle was already lost. Whatever words of caution he had prepared fell away. He sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly, and quietly backed down, murmuring something about needing to reflect. Catherine inclined her head politely but left the room without another word, her hand finding William's as they departed. And though the king's words signaled retreat, Camilla wasn't ready to accept defeat so easily, and her next move proved it. With the eyes of the world upon them at the next royal engagement, Catherine made a statement so subtle yet so powerful that even Camilla couldn't recover. The charity gala had been on the calendar for months, touted as a moment of unity, a public display of grace and strength, after whispers of tension had begun to circulate. But beneath the glamour, Catherine understood exactly what this night meant. A chance for Camilla to reassert control, to brush the past weeks under the carpet and reclaim the narrative. But Catherine arrived, determined to ensure the story written tonight would be hers and Charlotte's alone. She walked into the grand hall with Charlotte at her side, both of them immaculate, poised, and radiating confidence that dared anyone to question it. The cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and aides scurried to keep the evening running seamlessly. Yet all eyes drifted as if drawn by an unseen force to the quiet showdown unfolding just beyond the polite chatter. Camilla approached first, her expression polished but tight, her movements deliberate. She extended her hand toward Charlotte, her tone dripping with forced warmth as she said, "Darling, how lovely to see you here." But Charlotte, standing just a breath closer to her mother than usual, simply looked up, nodded faintly, and tightened her grip on Catherine's hand without uttering a word. Catherine didn't flinch, her gaze locked with Camilla's, and though no words passed between them, Her quiet defiance roared louder than any outburst could have. It wasn't a confrontation in words anymore. It was a war of presence, of resolve, and of boundaries drawn so firmly that even Camilla's most practiced composure began to falter under the weight of it. Onlookers sensed it immediately. Whispers rippled across the room like wind through leaves, subtle but impossible to ignore. Even those who couldn't hear what had or hadn't been said could feel the shift in the air. For the first time, Camilla appeared diminished, her usual air of superiority paling against Catherine's unwavering calm. Later that night, photographs from the event began to circulate. Catherine standing tall, unyielding, with Charlotte by her side, and Camilla retreating ever so slightly into the background. The press delicately labeled it an awkward but graceful royal moment, careful not to fan flames they could already feel flickering. But those within palace walls knew better. They saw the truth captured in those images. A mother who refused to let her daughter shrink, who refused to be silenced, who refused to play by anyone else's rules. And as the family posed for pictures that evening, one thing was clear. The monarchy's future now bore the unmistakable imprint of a mother's courage. Behind palace walls, history was rewritten not by kings or queens, but by a mother who refused to let her child be diminished. Back at Adelaide Cottage, the grandeur of the palace and the heavy air of Balmoral felt far away. Catherine sat alone in the quiet of her room that night, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion she'd kept at bay for weeks. The emotional toll weighed on her, but so did a quiet sense of triumph. In her hands, she held a battle won not through public speeches or grand gestures, but through unshakable resolve. She had drawn a line no one had dared to before, and it held. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale and feel the faintest sense of peace. Charlotte, once so timid and withdrawn, had already begun to blossom again under her mother's watchful care. Each day, Catherine noticed her confidence slowly returning, the spark in her eyes when she spoke, the certainty in her little laugh, the way she no longer flinched under the gaze of others. It was subtle but unmistakable, and it told Catherine everything she needed to know. Her daughter's spirit was intact, and that, above all else, was her victory. William came to her that evening, standing in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "You've been extraordinary," he said quietly, as though he, too, had finally grasped the depth of what she'd endured. "You never wavered. Thank you for protecting her, for protecting all of us." Catherine met his gaze, her eyes still heavy with everything unsaid, and nodded just once, feeling the weight of his acknowledgement settle between them. In the days that followed, Camilla retreated into a quieter role around the children. She still attended events, still appeared in photographs, still wore the polished mask the world expected, but she kept her distance from Charlotte. Even the palace aides began to notice. They whispered among themselves about the shift in power, about the way the balance in the family dynamic had tilted ever so slightly, yet irrevocably in Catherine's favor. No one dared speak it aloud, but everyone understood. And Catherine, though she knew this would not be the end of challenges, felt something within her, hardened into certainty. She had proved something undeniable, not just to herself, but to everyone who had watched silently from the sidelines. Her daughter's spirit was untouchable. No matter the cost, she would ensure it remained that way. And though the world would never know the full depth of what happened behind closed doors, Catherine's quiet rebellion became legend, a boundary no one would dare cross again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.